For the Piaget protocol investigation, I chose to study Piaget's Conservation of Liquid Assessment 7. I had 7 volunteers for this study. They aged from 5 to 8 years old. I had, I'll go through the list of names. I had Megan, who's 5 years, 4 months. Oscar, who is 6 years, 4 months. Taylor was 6 years, 9 months. Adam was 6 years, 11 months. Ellen was 7 years old. It was her birthday that day. Susie was 7 years, 1 month. And Brian was 8 years, 10 months. So, for this experiment, I had 2 cups. Now, I labeled the cups, all the containers, just so whenever I was talking with the students, they had something to refer to instead of this cup, that cup. So, they would call them cup A or cup B or container A. Whatever they chose, but they would call them by their name so I could keep them straight. So, first, before the experiment even started, I had each student measure out a cup of water, and with my help, and we poured them into cup A and cup B, so we all knew how much water was in each container. Then I asked the question, take a look at these 2 containers. What do you notice? Are they filled with the same amount of water? Now, none of the volunteers had any trouble answering this question. They all were correct, and they said that, yes, they were filled with the same amount of water. So then the next step was I have another cup labeled C, and I took the water from cup B, and I dumped it into cup C. Then I asked the question, is there more water in this cup, or is there more water in this cup, or do they have the same amount of water? Now this is where it became a little tricky for some of the volunteers. This is where I began to classify what level of thinking they were at. 3 out of the 7 were in the pre-operational stage, which Piaget mentions that it's the ages between 2 and 6, excuse me. So Megan and Taylor, Megan's 5 years, 4 months, and Taylor is 6 years, 9 months. They both told me that the height of the water determined the amount of water. So they both said that A had more water and C had less water. So, and then Susie, who is 7 years, 1 month, also said that A had more water, but she said that when I poured the water into cup C, she's saying they weren't equal anymore. In fact, she was associating the size of the cup as determining the amount of water. She said that because C is much bigger, the water level would be lower, which means A has more water in it than C because the water level is higher. So then, for the rest of the volunteers, I identified them at concrete operational level of thinking, because when I got to this stage, most of them were sure on their reasoning. 2, Oscar, who's 6 years, 4 months, and Ellen, who is 7 years old, they had trouble first identifying that the amount of water was the same, but I could sense the confusion, but they continued and they became more confident in their reasoning and answers, and they finally came to the conclusion that, you know what, they do have the same amount of water, that the container didn't determine the amount. So, and then the next step was, even though 3 out of the 7 couldn't get past that step, I still continued just to see if their answers would change or just to see what would happen. So then I poured the water from C back into the original cups, A and B, and then I asked the question again, which one has more water, or are they the same? And all of them, even the ones that were having trouble with cup A and cup C, knew that cup A and cup B had the same amount of water still. So next, after that, I have this container, and I poured the water into container D. And I asked the question, is there more water in this container, or is there more water in this container, or do they still have the same amount of water? And for those 3 that had trouble with A and C, they said the same thing, that height determined the amount of water and A had more water. But for those in the concrete operational level of thinking, they knew that they still had the same amount of water. Now, Adam, who's 6 years, 11 months old, and Brian, who's 8 years, 10 months old, they seem to be at a later stage of concrete operational thinking because, well, the reasoning and their answers were more detailed, and they were more confident with their answers, and they had no trouble throughout the whole thing. They knew that these 2 containers had the same amount of water because I started with A and B. In fact, they thought that I was trying to trick them, so anyways, then I went a little further and I asked the question, so if I add more water to this container, container D, they will still both have the same amount of water, right? And I wasn't trying to trick them, I was just trying to see how their thinking was, and they both said no, now container D has more. When I asked them why, they said that it's because I added more water to it. In fact, Adam, who he was kind of getting involved with the experiment, which I loved, he said that if I poured the water from back into D, that it would overflow, and he actually wanted to do it. So I let him dump the water from D back into B to see if he was right, and he was. Now if I keep going, it's going to overflow. So the idea behind this study was for the volunteers to determine, they were supposed to identify that the cup size did not determine the amount of water. That the water remained the same no matter what throughout the study. 3 out of the 7, I identified them as the pre-operational stage, and 4 out of the 7, they were in the concrete operational stage. So what I've concluded is that Piaget suggested that children enter the concrete operational stage, which is where they develop the ideas of, they understand the idea of conservation better. So he said that they enter this stage at about 6 or 7, which wasn't definite in my I found not to be definite in my study. Not all of the children that were 6 years old were ready for that type of thinking. So the idea of conservation wasn't quite developed. I believe that Piaget was correct at identifying the advances of thinking, but the age of that onset of thinking may occur earlier or even later. So what I've learned from this activity is, now that I understand that students' misconceptions about a concept may not be because of their level of intelligence, rather it could be because of their level of thinking developmentally. Each child progresses developmentally at their own pace and in their own unique way, and it's up to us teachers to encourage alternative ways of thinking so they can reach a solution maybe in a different way that they could understand. Finally, I believe that I really need to start examining the way students' thought processing is before I completely dismiss their ideas or solutions, because their way of coming to a solution may be completely different than what I expected or what I would have thought. So, that's all.